Characters of the Reformation, Part 4. St. Thomas More. The portrait of St. Thomas More, in any serious dealing with the English Reformation, must differ in quality from any of the other portraits in this fashion, that it is the portrait of a medium through which we are enabled to understand what the English mind of that day was. In other words, we do not, as in the case of Catherine of Aragon or Henry, Anne Boleyn, Cromwell, or any of the others, concern ourselves particularly with the external events of the man's life. They may be told briefly. They are easily summarized, and they are universally known. He was born in the high and wealthy legal world of Catholic England, 13 years before King Henry VIII. He inherited, and stepped naturally into, the greatest honors and legal position. He abandoned them all and died for the faith. There is no problem of a political nature attached to that famous name. There is no plot or intrigue. We have not to seek out and guess what was really at work in him by way of ambition or anything of that kind. What we can do, and what is of importance, is to understand what the man was interiorly, what kind of victory it was which he won, and how what he was and the victory he won explain the time. The task is all the more necessary because, in a very subtle way but a very important one, the St. Thomas More is badly misunderstood. And throughout misunderstanding him we misunderstand the nature of the English Reformation itself, as well as the peculiar and individual greatness of this individual martyr. What I may call the conventual portrait of the man, the one which both Catholics and Protestants accept, for he is quite as much admired in the other camp as in ours, is something as follows. While most of England was following the lead of King Henry and cutting itself off from the unity of the Church, and while the country as a whole was going Protestant, a few men among the laity stood out for the old Catholic position. They would not listen to any talk of a breach with the papacy, which they knew to be of divine institution, and the very keystone of the Church. Therefore they boldly sacrificed themselves rather than give way to the new claims of the lay state, or admit Henry to be the supreme head of the Church, or accept Protestant doctrine, or admit that Anne Boleyn was queen, or that her child Elizabeth could legitimately become queen after her. Of these few laymen who so stood out, the most distinguished was a great lawyer, a man of good birth, who had acquired early a great position at the bar, and had become Lord Chancellor of England. He was also a great scholar, and eminent throughout Europe. But he laid down his life in the cause of the Church as against Protestantism, and on that account has been canonized. That, I say, is roughly the picture presented. Now the true picture tells us things far more profound, and the character it presents is far more subtle, far more tempted, and far more an example of sanctity and martyrdom than so simple a summary would lead us to believe. The external side of this conventional portrait is right enough. Thomas More was a great lawyer who had early achieved fame and fortune in his profession, had become Lord Chancellor of England, was eminent throughout Europe for his scholarship, a great international figure, and was put to death for refusing to deny a point of Catholic doctrine. What is wrong about it is the internal interpretation. Those who thus simplify the story making it a plain scheme of black and white, do so either because they are insufficiently acquainted with the details of that career, or because the right emphasis is not laid in the right places by those from whom they have drawn their information. Further, the conventional portrait, which I have just sketched, implies a misunderstanding of the spirit abroad at the time of the English Reformation. The whole point of the true story is twofold. 1. The great martyr whom we venerate had all the intellectual and moral difficulties which attach to genius of his kind. 2. He acted alone. He was unsupported. As to the first point, he had the temptations which beset the intellectual man, the sensitive scholar, the successful worldly figure. To these temptations he was in danger of yielding, and had partly yielded. He triumphed over them, and that in a fashion quite peculiar to himself. That is why he is so glorious, and that is why he is so great an example. St. Thomas More was not simply a Catholic withstanding a movement towards Protestantism. Had he been that, he would have been almost like any other Englishman of his time. He was not simply a man determined on defending Catholic doctrine and boldly proclaiming it at all risks, because it was his nature thus to challenge and to combat. Had he been of such a sort, his victory over himself would have been far less than it was. As to the second point, let us note this all-important matter, which is the very core of this great sacrifice. He acted in complete isolation, and he laid down his life for one small strict point of Catholic doctrine only, and, what is more, a point of doctrine on which he had himself long doubted. He was not supported by the military spirit, the combative energy which delights in challenge and in counter-affirmation. He was not supported by any sympathy for himself, even among his nearest. He was not supported by the nature of his own mind, which had been hesitant and, even in essential matters, unchangeable. He gave himself up as a victim in spite of all those things which would make 999 men out of 1,000 deceive themselves that they might be doing right in yielding. This is the heroic and almost unique quality in More. To begin with, let it clearly be understood that St. Thomas More was a reformer. The whole of Europe was in turmoil between the old scholastic culture and the new passion for pagan antiquity, which was making Greek scholarship so powerful an instrument of criticism against ancient ideas and habits in religion. The whole of Christendom was moved also by a spirit which caused the younger men especially, and more especially the more intelligent and emotional of the younger men, to denounce the corruptions of the time, the errors of legend, the exaggeration of certain practices, and the doubtfulness or demonstrable falsity of many shrines and relics. St. Thomas More was just of the kind who would, according to the mere order of nature, have drifted from step to step, beginning with indignation against abuses, and ending with the full heretical position into which nearly all such men later fell. He was indignant against the social order of his time as well as against the abuses of the Church. What is more, his indignation inspired him to wit and to very high literary efforts, and men who discover such talents in themselves while they are still young nearly always fall into the temptation of becoming increasingly revolutionary as time proceeds. Sir Thomas More should, therefore, according to the order of nature, have become ultimately a violent opponent not only of the social order, but of that divine unity in the Church for which he laid down his life. All his character seemed to point that way. Again, he began as a man of profound worldly ambition. He fully recognized his own talents, and he gloried in them. They had led him to the highest political position in the state. Such a temper should naturally have made him in the long run acquiesce in all official action. Again, he was a man full of humor, and also full of domestic affection. He keenly felt how ridiculous a man looks in any isolated position, how absurd it is to be a crank, and he felt still more keenly misunderstandings with any of his own household. Such a man should naturally shrink more than would another from any action, let alone the acceptation of death itself, which he would suffer the public accusation of eccentricity and perverseness, and the reproaches of his own wife. Lastly, there is this point about the isolation of the martyr. He could foresee no fruit following upon his great example. In fact, during all the 400 years from his day to ours, no apparent political fruit had been borne by it. He was absolutely alone. He had nothing within or without, nothing promised in the future, nothing inherited from the past, nothing in the traditions of his habits and life to nerve him for what he did. And yet he did it. In order to understand how extraordinary the case is, and what a marvelous example it is of resolution and vision combined, let us appreciate exactly what it was that the blessed Thomas More defended at the cost of his life. He died for the principle that ultimately, in spiritual matters, the Pope was the head of Christendom, a principle which all Christendom was debating, and had been debating for more than 100 years, and on which all his lay world in England differed from him. He did not die for the real presence, as did many other after him. He did not die, as many another might have done, out of loyalty to Queen Catherine. He did not die as a protest against a doctrine generally held heretical. Still less did he die rather than give up some old fixed habit of mind attached to the ancient civilization of his country. He was not a man merely angry against change. On the contrary, he had been all for change. He did not die even at the end of a long public protest against the way in which things were drifting. He did not die for the Mass or for the sanctity of the clerical order. He died only for that one point of the papal supremacy, then universally doubted, and one on which it was common sense to compromise. To us today it seems an obvious thing to say, "Oh, but the papal supremacy is the very test of Catholicism." So Sir Thomas More himself saw, but so did not see the mass of his contemporaries, and so had he himself not seen a very short time before. When Henry VIII had himself been working against the Lutherans in favor of the papal office, saying that the papacy was a divine institution, Sir Thomas More had been of the opinion that it was not so. He had decided, from his reading up to that point, that the papacy was no more than a historical development, bound up, no doubt, within the structure of the Church, but of human origin, as is the most of ecclesiastical organization. 100 years before he would have been essentially by temperament one of those naturally supporting the authority of the great councils, and thinking them superior to Rome. Yet it was for that very point, which he had himself doubted, that he consented to die. Observe the circumstances of that death, and see how strange they were compared with what might be called, with due respect, the general run of martyrdoms. The king had determined to get his true marriage declared null, to make Anne Boleyn his queen, and to make Anne Boleyn's child his heir. Sir Thomas More did not protest when he saw that the royal policy was drifting more and more away from unity with the Holy See. He resigned his office, but he did so without explanation. If another should take his place who had not these scruples, he would raise no voice against the newcomer. When the royal supremacy was declared in its final and most conclusive form, in November of 1534, and the Pope was repudiated, though the Mass and everything else went on as usual, he remained what was called, in the language of the day, a loyal subject to his natural lord, King Henry. He did not challenge. He remained silent, so far as official action went, although, of course, his private conviction was known. Even when the oath of supremacy was administered, he was prepared to accept the marriage of Henry with Anne, and to admit that their child should inherit the throne, through the disinheritance of the true heiress, the Princess Mary. When the document was put before him for his acceptance, to be sworn to in the presence of Cranmer at Lambeth in the Archbishop's palace, he made no protest against it as a whole. All he said was that there was a point in the preamble which he could not accept. He held out over a detail, or what seemed to contemporaries a detail, one poor scruple. He said that the preamble implied something he could not in conscience accept. They did not want to sacrifice him. They bade him think it over, and he walked up and down in his gardens of Lambeth Palace, thinking it over, as they thought, but he was not likely to think himself into another state of mind. He stood firm on that one small point, that the phraseology of one small part of a law which, in everything else, he accepted, was at issue with orthodoxy. For that he was imprisoned, for that, many months after, he willingly accepted death. When they went through the form of trial in the last days before his sacrifice, it is remarkable to observe how silent he still remained, how wholly upon the defensive, still asking his opponents to prove their case, and keeping back in reserve all that he might have said. Until sentence was delivered, no man could have proved out of his own mouth what that doctrine was for, which none the less he was ready to lay down his life. Only when sentence had been passed did he speak at last, fully, and tell them precisely what his position was. To his own family as a whole, probably, to his wife certainly, to nearly all his friends, and to the mass of Englishmen of his time, his position was not heroic, but absurd. The king was already head of everything in England, and had been for generations past. He nominated to the bishoprics and great abbeys. His was the supreme court of appeal in nearly everything that mattered, and even though there was in the last declaration of full supremacy something novel, yet a quarrel between king and pope was something which the Englishman had been familiar over and over again for centuries. It would heal quickly, no doubt, as the others had done, and at any rate such political broils were nothing to sacrifice one's fortune for, let alone one's life. If indeed someone must stand out and be dramatic in this matter, and overdo the histrionics in the now quite out-of-date Thomas à Becket fashion, why, let it be a priest at least, and best of all some great prelate. No doubt men could understand Bishop Fisher, but why Thomas More? He was, I repeat, utterly alone. He had no support from without. And what support had he from within? That terrible question we cannot answer with certitude, but we can, I think, with probability. I think he had very little support from within. He was not only a skeptical mind, as has been the mind of more than one who has none the less suffered death for truth held by faith and not by experience. It was also a mind which had long practiced of seeing both sides of any question and thinking anything could be argued. On that particular point of the papacy he had himself argued sincerely enough upon the wrong side. I suggest that the martyr, in his last moments, had all the intellectual frailty of the intellectuals, and that at the end his skepticism was still working, but his glorious resolution stood, and that is the kernel of the affair. He had what is called heroic faith. Could he return to earth today, he would note with that irony of which he was a master, that his sacrifice would seem to have been in vain. Whether it were so or not, only a distant future can tell. But this much is certain, that of all those, and there were many, who bore witness in the 5 generations it took to root out their age-long religion from among the English, his would seem to have been the most complete passion, for he had nothing whatever to uphold him except resolve. Pope Clement VII. Clement VII was the Pope of King Henry VIII's divorce. He was reigning over the whole space of that affair, being appointed before the King of England had any intention of getting rid of his wife, and dying after the English schism had been virtually completed, and within a very short time of its final informal completion by the Act of Supremacy. For Henry's idea of getting rid of his legitimate wife, Catherine of Aragon, which idea, as we have seen, was probably more Anne Boleyn's than his own, cannot have arisen, at the very earliest, before 1525. The first, not absolutely certain, documentary allusion to it is in 1526, and overt action only begins in 1527. Now Clement VII was elected to the papal throne in 1523. Again, the last political acts by which the separation of England from the unity of the Catholic Church was made certain filled the years 1533 to 34. In 1533 you get the divorce pronounced by Cranmer. In spite of the papal prohibition, the marriage with Anne Boleyn acknowledged in her crowning as queen, the birth of Elizabeth and the declaration by law of her legitimacy, though she was illegitimate in the eyes of all Europe, and of course in those of ecclesiastical authority. While in the year 1534 you get all the facts one after another which culminated in the complete separation of England from Rome. That was already accomplished before the summer of 1534, and the seal was set upon the whole process by the full act of supremacy in the first days of November of that year, for it was the custom of many English Parliament that might be summoned to meet on or just after St. All Souls' Day. Clement died only 6 weeks earlier, at the end of September in that same year. He is therefore the man in supreme authority during all the period of the divorce and of the schism. Now the prime historical question which his reign arouses is this: could the position have been saved? Could the Pope, by the exercise of certain virtues or certain intellectual qualities in a fashion different from that which he actually showed, have prevented the loss of England to the unity of the faith? It is a question of the very first importance to the whole history of Europe, for, as I am never tired of repeating, if England had not gone, Christendom would still be united, and all Europe would be Catholic today. The answer to this question is not, I think, doubtful. Though Clement was guilty of great weakness and of tortuous policy, though he often sacrificed the spiritual to the temporal, yet he cannot be made responsible for the disaster. Nothing could have prevented the schism save the Pope's pronouncement in favor of a divorce, and that the Pope could not do without flying in the face of Christian law, of which he was the supreme guardian by the nature of his office. In order to appreciate the truth of this, let us begin by appreciating who and what Pope Clement was. He was the son of Julian de' Medici, who in his turn was the brother of the famous Lorenzo de' Medici, that great despot of Florence generally called Lorenzo the Magnificent, not only one of the wealthiest and one of the most powerful princes of the Renaissance, but also one of the most striking of the many striking characters of that time. The Medicis were a family which had grown enormously rich in commerce amid a commercial community, their fortunes being undoubtedly helped by many an evil practice, and particularly by usury and oppression. They had become so wealthy that they ranked with the reigning sovereigns. John, the second son of Lorenzo, became, through the influence of the Medician name and its vast financial interest, as also through his own striking character and the excellent training he had had, an obvious candidate for the papacy, as the papacy then was, unfortunately, with its great worldly interest and overlaid by the idea men had of it, including the popes themselves, that it was not only the supreme head of the church, but an Italian principate. It was this John de' Medici, reigning as Leo X, who was pope when the great outbreak in Germany took place. He and his advisers, as we know, misunderstood it, and so the Lutheran movement grew under his reign. His court was splendid, his patronage to the arts glorious and fruitful. He himself was of good life and a scholar, but all that side of his character, eminently fitted for the general and worldly duties of his supreme office, was of worldly influence only. Worldly he was, and worldly wealth and interests did he represent. He kept at his side, to help him manage the political side of the church, this cousin of his, Julius, the son of his father's brother Julian. Julius de' Medici was made cardinal, and was the right-hand man of his cousin Leo X during the reign, after the brief interval of that very fine reforming character Adrian VI, who, if he had lived, might well have reversed the current and reunited Europe. Julius de' Medici was elected at the age of 45 under the title of Clement VII. He was a man of excellent morals, very great erudition, good manners, perfect refinement, if anything rather too much delicacy of mind and of taste, a splendid patron of the arts and a sure judge of excellence in them. He was also a remarkably hard worker, taking the tremendous duties of his office most seriously. Moreover, he was as intelligent as any man in Europe. What he lacked was simplicity, also strength of initiative and power of direction. He lacked both those qualities which make for strong command through what may be called the squareness of a character, and those which make for successful command through the moral simplicity of a character. In the face of a difficult and involved position, his policy became a tangle of secret and involved intrigues, and he had that fatal symptom of weakness which takes the form of always playing for time. There are, obviously, occasions when playing for time is wise, but Clement VII was one of those men who always play for time, and when they find a decision difficult, say to themselves that with sufficient delay anything may turn up in their favor, and who, therefore, create delay for its own sake. All his method, from the first mention of the desire for divorce expressed by the English court, up to the very last still hesitating and half-tentative declarations against the actions of the English government, consisted in dependence on delay. For 7 years he played delay as his only card. Nevertheless, for all his weaknesses and for all his errors, he could not, I repeat, have prevented the disaster. Or at least he could have prevented it at the price of disloyalty to the prestige and power and supernatural claims of the papacy, which it was his first duty to protect. Had he hastened things and pronounced against Henry, as brief a time as could, with decency and the observation of forms, have been managed, the schism would still have taken place, because those who were managing the impulsive, sensual, and therefore weak will of the English king were determined to have the divorce, or, if they could not get it, to break with the head of Christendom and have it pronounced upon the local authority of their own servant, the primate of England. They had behind them not only the will of Anne Boleyn, and later the powerful brain and capacity for rule of Cromwell, but the driving power of universal greed in the wealthier classes, who were straining at the leash to be let loose upon the property of the Church. I take it that the earliest date on which Clement might have definitely pronounced for or against Henry's claim was late in 1530, or more probably early 1531. In practice, perhaps, considering all the obstacles of forms, appeals, and the rest, it might have been impossible before 1532. At any such stage, it would have been too late. To have granted the divorce against justice and ecclesiastical law would have ruined the already shaken papal office, quite apart from the fact that Catherine belonged to the most powerful ruling family of Europe. But it is equally true, and that is what people miss, that if Clement had been a more straightforward man and had pronounced in favor of the Queen at an earlier date and against Henry, it would have been already too late to save England. Henry was already thoroughly and openly in the hands of Anne Boleyn, and already privately in the hands of Thomas Cromwell, with the whole of the English territorial class ready, under the protection of Anne and Cromwell, to spring upon the revenues of religion. It has been the general fashion for your official anti-Catholic historian, both of the English and German Protestant variety and of the French and Italian anti-clerical variety, to ascribe Clement's reluctance to pronounce in favor of the divorce to the fear and pressure of the great Emperor Charles V, Queen Catherine's nephew and the head of her family. Too many Catholics have been affected by the general trend of the written history around them, and have half assented to this idea. It is a false judgment. Clement's mere political intentions during all his reign were obvious enough, and even necessary. His policy was certainly not merely to yield to the powerful emperor. It was rather to play the emperor's power against that of the French king, with whom he was in alliance during all the latter part of the business, the government of Henry of England, and thus be independent of both. It is true that he was reconciled with Charles V, after having been treated as a virtual prisoner by the irregular troops of that emperor. It is true that after long double negotiations and the secret support of Charles' rivals, he came to an open agreement and crowned Charles at Bologna in 1530. It is true that of the various great political forces pulling the papacy various ways, the force of Charles V was at the critical moment, 1532, the greatest. But it is not true that it decided the issue. What decided the issue was the necessity that any pope would have been under, strong or weak, straightforward or intriguing, to decide upon the merits of the case. Clement went to the extreme limits of concession to Henry VIII, rather to those who ran Henry VIII. He went beyond the limits of due and rightful concession. The weakest and most blamable of all his acts was a secret promise that he would not recall the case to Rome, but let it be concluded in Henry's kingdom and under Henry's eye. It is true that this promise was conditional, that Clement left himself a loophole of which he could take advantage, and of which he did take advantage when Catherine lodged her appeal. Still, it was intended to deceive and cause delay, and was an act the more reprehensible on that count. Yet even with all these concessions, with all his hesitation, and chance phrases which seemed to give Henry hope of succeeding, the central fact remained. Catherine had solemnly denied the consummation of the original marriage. She was a woman of high character. She swore she had never been the real wife of Henry's brother, who had died as a boy, and Henry never contradicted her. Proof sufficient to overset that solemn declaration was lacking. There was no sufficient ground upon which to quash the marriage of Catherine with Henry, and declare it null, unless Clement had been willing to admit that he was not the supreme judge in a moral case, that is, unless he had been willing to stultify all the claims and positions of the papacy. He had himself said in his despair and anxiety that it would be a good thing if the Queen of England were in her grave. He had allowed all manner of suggestions for outflanking the difficulty. He had even considered Catherine's voluntary renunciation, and of course everything would have been made easy if Catherine had consented no longer to press her solemn declaration or to insist upon her appeal. But with Catherine making that appeal, and taking the position she did, Clement had no choice but to act as he acted, even at the risk of losing England, and perhaps, so delicate was the situation, France, the ally of England, as well. Those who have blamed him most have failed to emphasize his chief grounds for hesitancy and delay, grounds which would have affected even the strongest character. All Christendom appeared to be breaking up, and though England was but a comparatively small and weak power compared with France or the Empire, what side she would take in the universal religious struggle was bound to make all the difference, and a pope must needs think twice or three times before he determined, however great the moral necessity, to risk the loss of England. We may sum up the situation by saying that if a stronger and more direct mind had been at work in the successor of St. Peter, the English schism would have arrived with less loss of honor and moral authority to Rome. But we must add that as much as Clement's weakness and shuffling must be regretted, he never passed the boundary beyond which there is abdication or denial of authority. He never compromised the fundamentals of the papal power, and of its awful claim to moral supremacy among men. There is something supernatural in all this. We always have to be careful in history not to exaggerate evidence of the supernatural, nor to ascribe to supernatural causes what may legitimately be ascribed to natural ones, but here there seems to be evidence of supernatural guidance. Just one step too far at one moment in papal history would have compromised the papacy in the eyes of posterity, and have given solid argument against its claims. That moment fell in the reign of Clement VII, and in that moment the papacy did not fail, even though the Pope had sailed so very near the wind. Clement just might, at the most critical moment when he was being hardest pressed, bullied, not knowing what to do, between the great contending forces of which he was the victim, he just might, I say, have overstepped the limit. He might, for instance, have issued a bull in which he declared the original papal power of dispensation for marriage with a sister-in-law to be void. He might have got out of his difficulties by allowing the verdict of the universities to be not advisory to the Holy See, but upon an equality with it. He might have taken any one of half a dozen steps, each of which would have been, for the first time, an admission by a pope that the papacy was not what it was, and, by a sufficient margin, Clement happily was preserved from so fatal an excess of weakness. He was preserved from it by that divine safeguarding of the Church which never fails, but which was also preserved from it by that element in him which, for all his faults, remained strong, a recognition of what was essential to his office. Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer, in the gallery of the English Reformation, is the counterpart to Thomas Cromwell. Between them they might be called the authors of the tragedy, but in very different fashions. Cromwell was the author in the sense of the man who creates. Cranmer was never more than an agent, though a willing agent, even in his heart of hearts an enthusiastic agent, a man who hated the Catholic Church and the sacraments, and in especial the sacrament of the altar and the Mass, whereas Cromwell was indifferent to religion, or rather let his sense of religion sink out of his consciousness till it reappeared in his last moments upon the scaffold, in the presence of the death which he so greatly dreaded. Cromwell, of all those who came across Henry VIII as one of his officials, was the one who most mastered the king, and could best boast that the policy of the country was entirely in his hands. Cranmer, of all those who came into official contact with Henry, was the most completely subservient and the least able to impose himself. But the way in which Cranmer was the counterpart of Cromwell in the story of the movement was most noticeable in one particular character. Cromwell, who should by rights be regarded as the chief figure of the time, has not received the full attention he should from popular historians or from the public. Cranmer has. Cranmer, who was essentially a subsidiary figure, has received the fullest attention. Quite until recently, any average English Protestant you might speak to of any degree of instruction, high or low, rich or poor, could have told you the central facts about Cranmer, how he was the great Archbishop of Canterbury, who helped Henry to break with Rome, how he had made the liturgy of the new Protestant service, and especially how he had been martyred under Queen Mary, being burned alive after a moment's weakness, of which he gloriously repented and which he expiated by his willing and terrible sacrifice. Especially was one story remembered as one of the principal and popularly traditional things in English history, how he thrust into the fire when he was being burnt the hand which had signed the recantation, saying, "This was the hand that did it." But if you were to ask the same men what they knew of Cromwell, most of them would say that they had only heard of one Cromwell called Oliver, and those who had heard of Thomas Cromwell might vaguely remember that he had something to do with putting down the monasteries. Cromwell, by the scale of his intelligence, his understanding of national and international affairs, his strength of will, tenacity of purpose, grasp of detail, all that marks a great statesman, was almost on the level of Bismarck or Richelieu. His extreme vileness and baseness, his brutality and gross cowardice at the end, does not affect this judgment as to his capacity, which he put to such abominable uses. But Cranmer showed little intelligence or foresight, was devoid of initiative, accepted through fear the various tasks thrust upon him, was always subservient, and by nature hypocritical and wavering. He did not want to be chaplain to Anne Boleyn in particular, though no doubt he was glad of the income. He did not want to plead for Henry VIII at Rome. He certainly did not want to be made archbishop. He took but a petty part in the spoiling of the church, and allowed his own diocese to be spoiled unmercifully. After being the mere servant of Henry and ready to belie any conviction of his own at Henry's orders, he became the servant of the tyrant Somerset after Henry's death, then the servant of the man who supplanted that tyrant. Then it was he who pitifully attempted to save his life under Mary by the most abject denials and repudiation of all that he really had at heart. There was one quality indeed about Cranmer which many have mistaken for greatness, and it is the one which we must linger upon, because error in this matter is so common, not only in his case, but in 100 others. Cranmer had great artistic power. He could frame a sentence of rhythmical and exquisitely beautiful English as no man has been able to do before or since. It is to him that the Anglican Church owes those prayers, the English prayer book, the diction and language of which have given it its strong hold upon the national mind. The litany of the English Church is his, a wonderful document as far as artistry is concerned. Presumably most of the collects, the translation of the prefaces of the Mass incorporated into the English service, and many other Catholic prayers similarly incorporated. His unique talent was not recognized in his lifetime. Its effect upon men's minds came much later. The strong affection which the average Englishman feels for the Book of Common Prayer and its fine phrases dates not from Cranmer's century, but from the next. It is often the case with great artists in prose and verse. They need time to manifest their gifts, and these are not apparent until long after they are dead. Cranmer having such supreme talent, in this one line of writing exquisite prose, a modern habit of mind would make us confuse such talent with real greatness. And it is at this point that I beg the reader to pause and consider how false such an attitude is. Great artistic talent in any direction, as of a poet or a prose writer or a painter or a sculptor or anything else, is hardly inherent to the man. It comes and goes. It is often possessed only for a short phase in his life. It hardly ever colors his character as a whole, and has nothing to do with the moral and intellectual stuff of the mind and the soul, by which alone men's intrinsic greatness can be measured. Many great artists, perhaps most great artists, have been poor fellows indeed, whom to know was to despise. So it was with Cranmer, and it is further to be remarked that he was one of those artists who can only work in a very limited frame. He wrote great masses of stuff, both in Latin and English, plenty of letters, disputations, reports, and the rest, most of them turgid and none of them remarkable. He only produced this astonishing prose when he sat down to do it with great care, thinking about every word and concentrating upon the narrow task before him. And, as is always the case with this kind of talent, he only excelled in short passages. With all this, it must be remembered that Cranmer stands at the origin of great English prose. He was not only the highest master of it, but he was also the chief originator of it. By that alone has he any claims to fame. What the man was himself, a brief recital of his life suffices to show. He was the younger son of a small gentleman, that is a small squire of land, in the English Midlands. He was brought up therefore to country sports, was always a very good rider and a good shot with the bow, which was odd because he had bad sight, and in reading or writing he had to keep his face close to the paper and peer at his work. He was destined for the church simply by way of providing an income for him, as was the custom with the younger sons of his class. He was made a member of a small insignificant foundation, Jesus College, in what was then the reduced University of Cambridge. He lived there for years, until he was nearly 40. He was about 2 years older than Henry VIII, but somewhat younger than Cromwell, leading the obscure life of a scholar with a certain amount of local reputation as an examiner in theology. He had, before taking holy orders, an adventure, which seems not to have been very reputable, but which ended in marriage, with a servant at an inn in Cambridge, and after her early death was taken back again into the fellowship of his college. The violent movement, which had begun as criticism partly scholarly and partly theological of clerical corruption, and which soon turned into revolt against the Church, laid hold of a small but very active minority in Cambridge, while he was passing there through early manhood to middle age, and though he certainly sympathized with all attacks upon Catholicism, for he had begun to hate the religion of his upbringing, yet he was too timid to give any active expression to his feelings, for all the official world of England was strongly orthodox, and even after the break with Rome, Henry, as we know, insisted upon teaching a full Catholic doctrine in everything but the papacy, and on the Mass and the sacraments, and everything else in the general life of the Catholic people. Cranmer was at Cambridge when Erasmus was beginning his work there, but he seems not even to have met Erasmus. He was there when Barnes preached his famous revolutionary sermon. He was there when all the small group of enthusiastic religious revolutionaries were running their risks, but he himself ran no risk at all. What brought him into prominence was the fact that two men in whom Henry placed great reliance, Gardiner, a man of great capacity whom Wolsey had made important and who was Secretary of State to Henry, and Fox, Gardiner's right-hand man, recommended him to the king. They were both Cambridge men, and thus knew of Cranmer. They were certainly acquainted with the fact that he could write, and with his local reputation for reading in theology and power to argue theological points. When, therefore, Cranmer, in a private conversation, supported the idea of appealing to the universities of Europe against the Pope, an idea which he did not originate, it had already been discussed for 2 years, Henry sent for him and bade him draw up a brief or argument in favor of his divorce. At the same time Cranmer was put to live in the Boleyns household, but it seemed probable, from a phrase of Cardinal Pole's, that he already had some connection with the Boleyns before then. At any rate, he became Anne Boleyn's chaplain, and is sent to Rome to plead the cause of the divorce before the Holy See. And then, when it became clear that Anne would never get rid of her legitimate rival, Queen Catherine, by papal decision, that she must rely upon an English prelate of Henry's to pronounce the divorce, Cranmer, insignificant though he was, became her obvious candidate for the primacy of England, that is, the archiepiscopal see of Canterbury. Now at that moment anything that Anne Boleyn wanted to happen in England did happen. The aged and saintly Archbishop Warham conveniently died in the year 1532, and Cranmer, having been hurriedly sent for from Italy, was made archbishop. He was made archbishop as a Catholic, in full communion with Rome, and by leave of Rome, and took the oath of allegiance to the Pope. But he was put up to make a private declaration that he would perjure himself if necessity arose, since he did not regard his oath to the Pope as binding against the interest of the king. This, of course, was kept secret. Cranmer then proceeded, at the orders of the king, to pronounce Henry's marriage with Catherine null. He was further ordered to crown Anne Boleyn as king. When her child Elizabeth was born, he baptized her and stood godfather to her. Later, when Henry got tired of Anne Boleyn, Cranmer speedily turns against this woman to whom he owed all his promotion and position, and in whose household he had been nourished, wormed out of her by feigned friendship some sort of admission of guilt, and betrayed her to Henry. His miserable weakness and subservience was thus guilty of her blood. After that, he did his best to help Cromwell secretly in the undermining of Catholicism in the country. He was particularly instrumental in deceiving the king over the new English translation of the Bible, which the king was assured was orthodox, though the most essential words had been mistranslated so as to give Scripture, and particularly the New Testament, a Protestant sense. But he abandoned Cromwell just as he had abandoned Anne Boleyn, cringing to Henry when Cromwell fell into disfavor. With Henry's later young wife, Catherine Howard, he played exactly the same trick he had played with Anne Boleyn. Catherine Howard represented the strongly Catholic faction, and it was Cranmer who gathered the denunciations against her, who wormed out a confession by feigned friendship and promises of forgiveness exactly as he had done in the case of Anne Boleyn, and he was guilty of Catherine Howard's blood as he had been guilty of Anne's. So long as Henry lived, he dared not say anything openly against the Catholic Church. He continued to say Mass with all due pomp and ceremony, much as he had come to loathe the Holy Sacrifice and the Blessed Sacrament. He sent away the German wife whom he had secretly married because Henry would not have a married clergy. Up to the very day of the king's death he played the part of Orthodox archbishop, Catholic in all save the schism with Rome. The moment Henry was dead, the gang who began to loot the church still further and to try and impose Protestantism upon England under Somerset, the protector of the young child upon the throne, found in Cranmer a willing helper. As I have said, when, within that gang, one tyrant proposed to oust another, he always followed the winning side. During those 6 years which saw the first attempted extirpation of the Mass, and the rebellions of the people all over the place in defense of their religion, Cranmer was active in defending the tyranny and framing the new Protestant English service, which was to replace the immemorial sacrifice. His name came first in the list of those who proposed to make Lady Jane Grey queen in order to keep out the legitimate heiress Mary. Then, when Mary was triumphantly brought into power on a wave of popular enthusiasm for her and for the Church, he makes abject apology in order to save his life. But at that moment he was stung into the single action, the only one of his career, which shows but slight and hesitating courage. He strongly denied in private that he had ever said Mass at the Queen's orders. Men, knowing his wretched character, had taken it for granted that he would never round once again. The report annoyed him, and he therefore wrote this private protest. But he had not the courage to publish it. It was published in spite of him. He was thrown into prison, tried for heresy, convicted, and deposed. During his trial he shifted and wiggled perpetually, trying as best as he could to get out of the position into which his flagrant recent acts had led him, for he had not only worked with all his might to destroy the Mass in England, but had actually drawn up a code of laws by which men should be punished with death for accepting the sacrament of the altar. Then, when he had been degraded from his episcopal office and function and condemned, he saw too late that they might really intend to put him to death, though hitherto to execute an archbishop for heresy was a thing unheard of. He therefore made one recantation after another in the hope of saving his life. These recantations became stronger and stronger as he went along, till at last he wrote out and published one of great length, in which he stretched to the utmost his professions of remorse and penitence. He threw himself upon the divine mercy, declared he was not worthy to live, said he deserved his fate, especially as he had led so many into error, and compared himself to the penitent thief on the cross, declaring that he could rely upon nothing but the infinite charity of Christ for such a case as his. Up to the last moment he did not know whether these protestations of his had been effectual or not in deceiving the authorities. On the day fixed for the execution he was taken to St. Mary's Church in Oxford for his recantation to be made as public as possible, and for a sermon to be preached upon it. The rule was, of course, that on such public recantation the prisoner for heresy was pardoned, and Cranmer had his recantation all ready to read. But while he sat there listening to the sermon preached about him, there came a phrase in that sermon which suddenly destroyed his hopes. The preacher had been told by the government to announce their decision that they could not pardon Cranmer after all. He then did a dramatic thing. He went up to read his recantation, but at the most critical point in it suddenly declared that all he had said in favor of the Church and against his former errors was insincere, and had merely been said in order to save his life. Now that he had to die anyhow, he would confess that he was utterly opposed to the Catholic system and the papacy and all the rest of it. There was a great hubbub in the church, in the midst of which the little old man, still very vigorous, though grown bald and nearly blind, he was not far from 70 years of age, ran through the rain with the congregation and the street mob at his heels, came out by the north gate of the city, and was clasped to the stake which stood in front of Balliol College. As the smoke rose about him, he was seen to put out his right hand, as he had said he would, putting it first into the fire as expiation for having signed his recantations. There is an historical and moral point of some importance connected with Cranmer's death. Had the authorities a right to act as they did? The answer would seem to be that technically they had such a right, but that by custom and equity they had not. A heretic having once been condemned for obstinate heresy and handed over to the secular arm, was from that moment subject to execution. But it had nearly always and everywhere been admitted in practice that if, even after one sentence, he recanted, he was to be saved. There were even cases in which a man actually recanting after the fire had been lighted, and obviously acting only under the influence of extreme suffering, was released. Therefore it may fairly be urged that Cranmer had by his abject and repeated recantations earned the right to live at least, and that in putting him to death the government was breaking an implied contract. On the other hand, they could plead that the man's crimes had been so enormous and his position so especial that no reprieve for him could be possible. To me personally, the plea has always seemed insufficient. It seems to me unjust to have accepted these numerous recantations, and to have obviously favored their repetition and increasing emphasis, if they had not intended to spare him